this workshop was useful and how we can improve this in the future, as well as to provide kind words to the facilitator for all of their hard work. This will also be used for the facilitators and RCDs reporting. Importantly, by filling out this survey, this also ensures that you receive a certificate of attendance via our RCD management system. So I'd just like to introduce Dr. Ashil Singh quickly, and then I'll hand over the presentation to you, Dr. Singh, if that's okay. So Dr. Ashil Singh is a senior lecturer at the University of Johannesburg. His research areas include meaning in life and applied ethics, specifically on procreative ethics. His research interests also include Eastern philosophy, environmental ethics, philosophy of religion, African ethics, and metaphysics, and the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. He won the UJ Faculty of Humanities Best Postgraduate Teacher Award in 2021. Dr. Ashil Singh is UJ's Philosophy's Postgraduate Coordinator in Teaching. True to stereotype, he would like to point out that he has been a vegan since 2004. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Dr. Singh. Thank you, Dr. Singh, for taking the time to be with us today. We're looking forward to this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. If I'm not audible, please let me know. If my mouth appears to be moving, but you can't hear anything, just type something in the chat box. Thank you for that introduction. Of course, the last line, the vegan part, is meant as a joke. It is true, but it's also a joke. 20 years, maybe it's time for a change. Anyway, so I was asked to present this workshop on VIVA, supervisor processes and tips. I'm going to share my screen in a moment. I want to say a couple of things about that. Firstly, they're not called VIVAs anymore. They're called oral defenses. So that is reflected in my presentation. And also, there isn't much I can say from the supervisor's perspective. I'm going to qualify this as I speak, as I present this. Because the supervisor doesn't play much of a role in the oral exam, as I'll discuss. Nevertheless, we are all supervisors and we are all going to be part of the VIVA in some way, perhaps not as a supervisor per se. We'll discuss that. I also want to say that I think many of us are not from humanities. I'm from humanities, and there might be processes that you have in your individual faculties that are different to what I discussed today. And I would actually like to hear what you are doing in your individual faculties, perhaps in your departments, because I'm very curious about them. And I think we can take this as an opportunity to trade notes and perhaps come up with some best practices that can work across faculties, across departments. Let me share my slides now. Once I start them, also going to turn off my camera. Okay. The slide should be appearing. I think you'll be able to see my...
Yes, Doc, we're able to see your
Thanks.
Slides, but they're not in presenter mode. I don't know if you're able to switch it or if you're comfortable presenting like this.
Yeah, so let me click on that. I don't know if that will work. How about that? Did that work?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Right, so I've called it the Oral Defense Workshop. I haven't said explicitly supervisor. There is going to be a workshop on non-assessing chairs, I believe, in 2 sessions from now, so there might be overlap. Nevertheless, I'm coming from a specific department, philosophy, and a specific faculty, humanities. And I think that, like I said earlier, that the sharing of notes can be quite useful here. So apologies if there's overlap, but I think we can benefit from that sort of thing. So I'm senior lecturer at the Department of Philosophy, as I mentioned. Department of Philosophy, we can't spell that apparently. But I'm also a member of the faculty of the Humanities Faculty High Degrees Committee. So since 2020. So I've been involved with the VIVAs, now oral exam, oral defenses for quite some time. And I've seen it from various perspectives. I've not just seen it as from a supervisor's perspective. I've not just seen it from the non-assessing chair's perspective. I've also seen it from this faculty perspective. And I've been involved in not quite the crafting of various policy documents, but the revision of various policy documents. And we have had at this committee, we have had many discussions about the oral defense. So I'll share some of that with you in today's presentation. I've been non-assistant chair to several oral defenses. Some of you might not be familiar with the term non-assistant chair. I'm told that not all faculties have non-assistant chairs. I don't know if that's true, but again, please share your experiences with me. I will give a bit of a definition of non-assistant chair in a bit. Disclaimer, I've said much of this, I'm from humanities, so be sure to check your faculty's documentation. There might be things that I say today that don't apply to you in your department, in your faculty. So the rationale for oral defenses. Like I say, oral defense is formally what we formally call a VIVA. We no longer use the term VIVA, we call it an oral defense. It's a compulsory part of the PhD assessment process. It is optional in the MA assessment process. The key words here are assessment process. We can't decide at PhD level not to have an oral defense. And I'll show you the documentation, the official documentation from the university outlining why that's the case. What we experience, I think this is true in all faculties, we experience conflicting results. And humanities, we have three assessors. They give their verdicts. Some of them might say accept, two of them might say accept, for example, and one might say revise and resubmit. And if, of course, it's in the student's interest that the revise and resubmit is changed to something else, it's changed to ideally revise to the satisfaction of the supervisor. That means the student doesn't have this delayed assessment process, or this extended assessment process, I should say. And it can happen that in the VIVA, the conflicting assessor, as it were, might decide to change the verdict, hopefully to the benefit of the student. In my own experience, this has happened for the most part. I've had an experience recently where that wasn't the case. It was quite an extraordinary experience. I can't say much of it in terms of detail, but we can chat about it in the Q&A session, but also in my final slide when I speak about the various verdicts that assessors can offer. Assessor, you might know that term as examiner. I think the official university term is assessor. So the rationale for the oral defense continued. This is from our UJ policy document, Guidelines for the Implementation of the Compulsory Oral Defense for Doctoral Students. So I'm just quoting directly from the document. And all links and all italicization and text in bold, that's all directly from the document itself. So oral defense guidelines for implementation at faculty level. The academic regulations stipulate that a compulsory oral defense forms part of the academic requirements for a doctoral qualification. In addition, the Council on Higher Education, CHE, Doctoral Degrees National Report recommended that all institutions implement oral examination of doctoral degrees, since this is a key element of assessing achievement of the graduate attributes. The implementation of such an oral defense is mandatory for doctoral students who will graduate from 2024 onwards. Where this requirement is already included in faculty rules and regulations, implementation is in effect for 2023. So this document is for 2023. This document aims to provide a set of UJ guidelines to assist faculties in implementing the oral defense, and faculty should develop accompanying guidelines as appropriate for their specific domains. So I've been mentioning this throughout my presentation so far. We come from different faculties, different departments. Faculty includes the College of Business and Economics and the Johannesburg Business School. There's more from this document. Again, this is directly from that document. I haven't edited anything. I haven't added emphasis. Any emphasis you see is from that document. And I quote, "An oral defense is widely implemented across national and international higher educational institutions. And according to the CHE qualification standard for doctoral degrees, it is used as one means to demonstrate the candidate's independence and competency related to their specific study field, demonstrate that the candidate has achieved an in-depth understanding of their research, demonstrate that the candidate has achieved a broad knowledge of the field of research, confirm a candidate's achievement of some or all of the graduate attributes, such as reflection, autonomy, and independent ownership of the work reported in the thesis. Create an opportunity for doctoral candidates to engage with specialists in their respective fields. Ascertain whether all the requirements for doctorate have been met as stipulated in the National Qualification Framework in QF. Just want to highlight point 5 here, create an opportunity for doctoral candidates to engage with specialists. This is something in my department in philosophy that we do pay some attention to. When we select assessors, we're obviously careful to select assessors that are appropriate to the specific study, and also assessors we believe will judge it fairly. We can speak in the Q&A about some of your experiences. Here in philosophy, we have had assessors at all levels who have been sometimes not fair in their assessments, sometimes too harsh. So we do try to remember those assessors. We have an internal list to ensure that we don't jeopardize students in the future. But it is, when this works out well, when this oral defense works out well, it is a wonderful opportunity for students who are hoping to enter into this specific field to engage with experts in that field. I can remember one VIVA that I was a part of, I think it was late last year, where the student was treated in the VIVA as though she was a peer, as if she was a colleague at the same level. And it was very heartwarming to see. The assessors, I don't know if they said this explicitly, and it's not really the case, but they treated the VIVA, as it was then called, as a bit of a formality. They loved the thesis and they engaged with her in a collegial fashion, which is what we always hope, and spoke to her about her future after the thesis. And that was wonderful to see. It was that's the kind of VIVA sort of all the oral defense that you want. Not all of them are like that, though, unfortunately, and we'll discuss some of that. Still from that document, I've highlighted certain terms that I think we need to emphasize and we need to discuss further. So I've mentioned the non-assessing chair. That will be defined shortly. The non-assessing chair approved by the Faculty Research Committee, FHDC, of the respective faculty, at the time of accepting the assessor nominations, organizes the oral defense. So the NAC organizes that, not the supervisor. It would be interesting if that is the case in your faculty. Let's talk about that in the Q&A session. Of course, the non-assessing chair is part of the department and is doubtlessly supervising another candidate, and eventually will have to be in a VIVA of their own, oral defense of their own for their own student. Anyway, the oral defense should typically be organized as a hybrid event, allowing for online and in-person participation. So in philosophy, I don't think we've ever had a hybrid event. It's always been online. Apart from perhaps the supervisor and the non-assessing chair and the candidate being in the same physical room. Sometimes what we do is we hire a room at the university, usually at one of the nicer rooms with teleconferencing facilities. And we're physically together in that room, but the assessors join us online. There's something I don't have in my presentation, but I've just been reminded of it. Often we have assessors that are very far apart in terms of time zones. And it can take a bit of effort to get an ideal time. I know when I've been non-assessing chair, for many of the oral defenses I've had, to spend a bit of time, spend a few days, perhaps a few weeks, trying to get the precise date for the VIVA, the oral defense, sorry. I use a website called World Time Buddy. I'm going to try to put the link in the chat there. So there probably will be other websites that do this, but this has always been kind to me. Here in South Africa, we don't have to deal with daylight savings time, daylight savings time and the like, but people in other countries often have to deal with that. So this link will help you set up a time that takes into account daylight savings time, and also makes it easier for you to see how the different time zones stack up. What I found is assessors can be quite empathetic to the time zone differences. So very often they are willing to meet, say, very early or in the evening, whatever it might be. But just be empathetic with them when you approach them. I should emphasize that in our faculty of humanities, all of this is done by the non-assessing chair, not the supervisor. Nevertheless, you'll eventually have to do this. You will be placed in this role. Okay, back to this rationale for oral defenses. So the panel for the oral defense comprises of one, the non-assessing chair, in parentheses, an academic that is in no way involved with the study. So what that means is that you're an academic in that department, but you're not the supervisor, you're not the co-supervisor, you're not dealing with that aspect of the study. Of course, you're involved in terms of being a colleague with the supervisor, in terms of perhaps having taught that student maybe in the previous year, master's or honors or undergraduate, but that's okay. The non-assessing chair is typically the head of department or school, or a senior academic in the host department or institute school, if the head of department is involved in the study. So in humanities, it is now being strongly advised, if not required, that the non-assessing chair is someone who not only has a doctorate, but is at associate professor or professor level. The thinking there, as I understand it, is that the non-assessing chair is such an important role that you need someone with experience and academic standing. In our department, we, given our staff numbers and given our number of postgraduate students, we have around 100 postgraduate students. It isn't always possible to divvy up our labor in that fashion. So I've been non-assessing chair to many studies. And I think that I do agree that the non-assessing chair is an important, very important role. Nevertheless, just be aware that your faculty, you might say that might require associate professors and professors to fill this role, and not permit senior lecturers or lecturers to perform this role. Of course, the assessors are also part of the panel in humanities, and I think this is true for across the university. We have 3 assessors. I think at least one, so all of them must be PhD holders. All the assessors must have some kind of expertise in the relevant field of study. And at least, I think at least one must be international. I think that's right. At least one must be international from outside of the country. And I think all must be external to the university, if I remember correctly. Okay, and of course the supervisor or supervisor and co-supervisor is going to be there. But this is an important part. The supervisor has to be an observer. So you as a supervisor in the VIVA, in the oral defense, will be quote unquote present either online or in person in the hybrid situation. But you are not required, you're not permitted to intervene. You're not permitted to say anything. So observer means observer. All right, so before the oral defense, this is more specifically related to you as a supervisor and not talking only about the NACs. Supervisors must discuss the possible assessors with their respective DHDCs. That stands for Departmental Higher Degrees Committee. So I don't know if this is the case in other faculties, but we have in humanities, we have split up some of our functions in terms of these higher degrees. So we have the Faculty Higher Degrees Committee, yes, but in individual departments, we assess things like proposals. The thinking is that we are experts in these fields of study. So we scour through the proposals, and if we think it is they're fine, we send it to the FHDC for noting. At this level, at departmental level, we discuss the possible assessors. It's up to the supervisor to think about those assessors and share those CVs and online profiles with the departmental members. Perhaps you'll meet at a meeting, or perhaps you'll discuss this online. If there are objections, if you've noted something that might not make an assessor a good assessor, then that's where you deal with this before you send out those names to your faculty higher degrees committee. We also have to be aware of exhaustion, repeating assessors. It can be difficult in a field of study that is very niche. This often happens in philosophy. Often happens that we have to use assessors more often than we'd like, and we have to submit a motivation for why we're using an assessor. There also should be no obvious conflict of interest between the supervisor and perhaps the NAC and the assessors. So if you publish with that person in the last 2 years, for example, that would be seen in our faculty as a conflict of interest, and that is not something that is going to be approved by the Faculty Higher Degrees Committee. I'm going to pause quickly. I have a question. How often is the oral defense held? How soon after you receive your results? So the oral defense is held after the assessment reports have come in from the assessors. At the Faculty of Humanities, we try to get the oral defense done within a couple of weeks of receiving all the assessor reports. The assessor reports come in, they give, each one gives a narrative report where they outline the strengths and weaknesses of the thesis, give comments on the thesis, and then there's a separate document where they have to give their verdicts. There will be preliminary verdicts. I'll speak about these verdicts in the final slide of the presentation. Those verdicts can change on the basis of the discussion in the oral defense. I'll chat more about that in a bit. And I'll get to how soon after you receive your results. I'll get to that because what happens at the end of the oral defense is not taken as the official last word on the verdicts. There's only one, in humanities, there's only one oral defense. There's no option of having more than one oral defense for a given thesis, for a given student. Our oral defense is virtual. In my experience in philosophy, all of them have been virtual. We don't fly in assessors. We don't. We generally assume, even if the assessors are local, that they would prefer to do it virtually. So the short answer is yes, they are virtual. They're done. This university is obviously has obviously integrated Teams into our systems. Some assessors would prefer the Zoom or Google Meet or something like that. But I've always tried to do Teams just because it's integrated into our systems, and you can create a shareable link that the assessors do have, and it's usually not a problem. They don't need to download any apps or anything like that. So before the oral defense, the non-assessing chair must approach the DHDC-approved potential assessors after receiving the go-ahead from the supervisor. So if it wasn't clear before, in the Faculty of Humanities, for each thesis, for each study, there is a non-assessing chair assigned to that study. It's not always at the start of the study. Usually it's toward the time when the study is being prepared for submission to the faculty for forwarding to the assessors. So perhaps 3 or 4 months before that is done. And the non-assessing chair, after receiving the go-ahead from the supervisor, must email each of those potential assessors. At this stage, the identities of those assessors will not be revealed to each other. It will become clear only, it will only be made evident on the day of the oral defense itself. That's when the assessors will finally meet each other. Virtually, of course. Provided that the assessors say, okay, we are fine with serving as assessors. We are fine with writing narrative reports, offering verdicts within, I think, in 6 weeks in humanities. And thereafter, being part of the oral defense, go ahead and appoint us. After they've said that, the NAC must, at the Faculty of Humanities at least, complete what we call a one-stop form, which lists the relevant details of the assessors, where they are based, I think the highest qualifications, and their CVs are also attached to that application. And this is viewed by our Faculty of Humanity, our Faculty High Degrees Committee at Humanities. And I think it would be similar in your respective faculties. But again, you can tell me during the Q&A. The NAC is responsible for following up with the faculty officer whether the FHDC has accepted the assessors, if no notification is received in a reasonable time. So this is important because I don't want to say it happens often, but it has happened that assessors were not assigned in time, and the study is ready to be sent out, and that's not a good thing. These procedures have to be followed because eventually all of this needs to be viewed by, at least in our faculty, by the Senate High Degrees Committee, and there needs to be documentation that proves that the appropriate procedures were followed. So before the oral defense, supervisors can prepare the candidates in various ways. So mock oral defenses, perhaps including other members of the department. So perhaps you host, you create a session where the candidate is going to be questioned by either the supervisor or other members of the department, and this gives the candidate a sense of what it will feel like to be in this position. Speaking again for my department, oral assessments are not a big part of what we do. They're actually quite rare. We do have a presentation module at honors and master's level, but apart from that, the assessments are written assessments. So it's quite strange for our students to be asked to speak on what they've written. And it can be useful to prepare them for that by doing this kind of mock oral defense session. I think it's essential to go through the anonymized reports. Discussion of responses is necessary. Again, at this stage, the assessors themselves don't know who the other assessors are, and the candidate also doesn't know who the assessors are. So the candidate will receive anonymized reports. These reports, by the way, in humanities are not shared with the assessors themselves. So the assessor does not receive the reports of the other assessors before the oral defense. I don't quite know why that's the case, but that is the case. So the supervisor and the candidate can sit down and look at the various reports and prepare responses. And in the oral defense itself, the student can respond to the questions. Usually what happens in oral defense is the assessor gets to focus on some of the salient objections raised in those reports. So here's some structure of the VIVA. This is the way we do it in philosophy, and I want to thank Professor Catherine Botha for creating a VIVA guiding document for us in our department. I think it's been shared with other departments in our faculty now. And I've adapted what comes up in the following slides from her document. So as I mentioned, assessors do not receive the reports of the other assessors before their oral defense. Online only is fine, as mentioned. The supervisor does not participate on the day. Supervisor is quote unquote present virtually or in person. The supervisor has to be there, but does not take part in the discussion and does not take part in the determination of the result. That is to say, the supervisor is in attendance only as an observer. The oral defense consists of 4 parts, and the whole process may not last longer than 90 minutes. I'd be eager to hear how other departments and other faculties do this, but this is what we've been doing in philosophy, and I think other departments are following us. The NAC should explain the 4 parts right at the start of the oral defense. I'm going to explain the 4 parts to you. The first part, the NAC, who is going to be chairing the session, of course, the non-assessing chair meets with all the assessors, that is to say the assessment committee, without the candidate being present. So the candidate, if it's hybrid, the candidate is in the waiting room, in another room. If it's online, the candidate just isn't in the online meeting. The candidate is invited when it's time to invite the candidate in. What we do, often either the NAC or the supervisor has candidate on a WhatsApp and says, come in, join the meeting by the link. So the candidate isn't present for this first part. In this first part, the NAC confirms the oral defense procedure, answers any questions regarding procedure or regulations, and settles on the process for how the rest of the VIVA is going to proceed. In part two, the NAC invites the candidate into the assessment room and informs him or her of the status of the defense. I don't know what that's supposed to be, of the oral defense and of the rules of procedure for the assessment session. Those rules of procedure, again, would be agreed upon in part one. The oral defense commences according to the rules of procedure established in part one, with each assessor being able to ask questions of the candidate. The VIVA consists of questions and discussion of any nature that the assessor deems appropriate to: one, ascertain that the student is the author of the work; two, determine what the student meant or intended by any part of the work. So sometimes the comments in the narrative report represent, or at least some of them represent, misunderstandings on the part of the assessor. And this is a chance for those misunderstandings to be cleared up. Three, determine whether the work is of an acceptable quality. So this is obviously a doctoral thesis. And what we found in philosophy is that the assessors do take this very seriously, and can be quite, I wouldn't say necessarily harsh during the oral defense, but they do want the student to engage with the comments. They do insist that certain comments are responded to satisfactorily during or after the VIVA. Four, they give the student the opportunity to reply to any concerns. Five, explore points of interest for their own sake and offer guidance and advice to the student for further development of this work and of the student's career. I mentioned the very good oral defense that one of the very good oral defenses that I was part of last year. A lot of SICs happened. A lot of guidance and advice was given to the student about what the student could do after the VIVA, after the oral defense. So please note the NAC may document but not take part in the discussion. So in this part of the oral defense, it's the student and the assessors having a discussion. What we like to do in philosophy is give each assessor a chance to ask questions for a set period of time. I think we give 30 minutes for this part of the VIVA. It's ideal to have a time constraint so that assessors avoid being long-winded, and also the candidate isn't going to be, put through the ringer for an indeterminate amount of time. So each assessor asks questions, the candidate responds to those questions or comments, and then the next assessor does the same. During this part, the NAC must just facilitate and not jump in the discussion, not try to help the candidate or anything like that. Part two continued. After all the assessors have put questions to the candidate is offered the opportunity to ask questions or offer comments. In my experience, not all candidates take up this offer. Usually they don't, but nevertheless, that option is there. So it's important that we note that the NAC should say right at the start of the oral defense that it is not permitted to indicate to the candidate at the outset or during the should be oral defense whether the thesis is deemed worthy of a doctorate. So of course, the discussion within the oral defense might indicate that a certain assessor is leaning toward a certain verdict, but that shouldn't be made explicit. It will not be explicit in the reports that are anonymized and given to the student. The student shouldn't see those verdicts. The student should not know what the preliminary verdicts of the assessors. So in the third part, the assessor asks the candidate and the supervisor to leave the assessment room so that the assessment committee can consult and arrive at a final recommendation on the result. A final recommendation is important in this process. It's what, at least in the humanities, is sought for the thesis. I'll look through shortly. I look through the various verdicts that can be given by the assessors. In part 3, the NAC will discuss the preliminary judgments of all the assessors, the NAC's impressions of the VIVA, and then establish whether the assessors are able to arrive at a final joint recommendation. In the NAC report on the oral defense, after the oral defense, the following must be made clear: whether the assessors were able to agree on a joint recommendation, in which case, what it was, the reasons for the recommendation, and any other important points arising in the discussion. Part 3 continued. If the assessors are unable to arrive at a joint recommendation, the NAC will report, 1, whether any defense, whether any assessor should be wish to adjust their provisional individual recommendation, and what the main points of disagreement were. And here's I think this page is not this slide is not a happy page for the supervisor, NAC, or candidate, but I think the procedure has to be followed, and we have to be clear as supervisors and NACs, and we have to make it clear for the student what happens in this case. So if no joint recommendation is arrived at, then the relevant faculty higher degrees committee may invoke one of the appropriate policy procedures to resolve the impasse. So there are various things we can do in humanities. We can go to a fourth assessor. We can choose an expert advisor or arbiter. That wording has changed recently. Or we can say, if it's a reviser and resubmit. I think in general, if it's a reviser and resubmit, unless there's some extraordinary circumstances, that student does have to revise and resubmit. And I've been involved in studies where students have had to revise and resubmit, and it's always stressful for the student. There's always a lot of work that has to be done with the student. Supervisor has to sit down and say, okay, this is what we need to do to appease this assessor or assessors. And there's only so much you can do as a supervisor. I think the student gets 6 months, if I'm not mistaken, to complete those revisions and produce a revised thesis and a letter outlining the changes made. The assessors will, of course, look at this letter and the revised thesis. And it's difficult. And happily, in many of the oral defenses I've been part of, a joint recommendation was arrived at. And mostly it wasn't, a major revision wasn't required. But when it was required, it had to be done. In the final part of the oral defense session, the NAC invites the candidate back into the assessment room and informally informs her of the decision of the examination committee. So this is related to what I mentioned mentioned before regarding the question about how soon after the oral defense are the results received. So after the VIVA, sorry, the oral defense, I keep saying that, after the oral defense, whatever the verdicts are, those are not official until it goes to the SHDC. So the student must be told that this is not official. So I use informally here because, as the NAC must emphasize, the outcome of the assessment process is not settled until the Senate Higher Degrees Committee at UJ has decided upon the recommendation it receives. So we just have to say it as a matter of procedure that it's unofficial or informal. The supervisor will be invited back along with the candidate and will discuss any proposed changes with the candidate only after the oral defense is concluded. I've been part of, as non-assessing chair, one oral defense where one of the assessors insisted on a revise and resubmit. So revise and resubmit to me, the assessor. And it wasn't really nice as NAC to be the one bearing that bad news, but it had to be done. and procedure had to be followed. As a supervisor, it's quite heartbreaking if your student is told that this thesis is not yet where it needs to be, and corrections need to be done. But it happens. So as promised, this is the box we have in humanities. I think it might be the same in other faculties. Let me know if not. The assessors give recommendations. I think this is after the VIVA, this is final recommendation. There's also a preliminary recommendation. But the assessors have a choice between 4 options. So the first one is what every supervisor, what every candidate wants. They want the assessor to say, I approve the thesis. So this recommendation may be made with or without minor corrections to be made to the satisfaction of the supervisor. The second one is, I approve the thesis provisionally, but the candidate has to make non-substantive corrections and improvements to the thesis to the satisfaction of the supervisor. So in practice 1 and 2 here count as equal in terms of the joint recommendation. So if 2 assessors say 1 and 1 assessor says 3, that counts as a joint recommendation because they've all approved, at least provisionally. They've not asked, none of them have asked for substantial amendments. And it goes back to the supervisor. And if there are minor comments to be, minor corrections, the supervisor has to supervise those corrections. And then it can be sent off to the faculty and then to the FHDC, I believe. But the assessor doesn't need to see it again. Though the assessor might want to see a final version of the thesis just for the sake of having that on a record. So 3 and 4, this is where things get into unhappy territory. So 3, I recommend substantial amendments to the thesis in the light of deficiencies identified in my narrative report, and propose that the revised version be submitted to me for reassessment. This is the aforementioned revise and resubmit. It's not nice again, but it's a good deal better than this one. I reject the thesis, in which case no reassessment is recommended or considered. That's option 4. I am trying to think. I think there might have been. I might have had a case of this many years ago as NEC, option 4, and I don't quite recall what we did there. We might have gone to a 4th assessor, or that assessor might have been part of VIVA. I'm not quite sure. I should say that you should feel free to speak to whoever is chairing your faculty higher degrees committee about these cases. Here in humanities, I think it's recommended that we speak about these difficult cases. It's recommended we contact the FHDC chair, because there may be options that avoid unnecessarily harming the student psychologically. Perhaps in the case of 4, the report is so egregiously, let's say, unqualified in its criticisms that it's decided to disqualify that assessor. I wouldn't say that's guaranteed. I wouldn't say anything like that. That's something you should speak to your FHCC chair about. What do we do in this particular case? But that's a very bad thing if the thesis is rejected. I think in any case, if there's one person who rejects the thesis, then another assessor has to be found if you don't go the VIVA route. Perhaps if this assessor is in the VIVA, that assessor's mind can be changed. And perhaps they move up to 3, which is a lot better than 4. This is partly why the VIVA exists, to give assessors the chance to speak with the student, because perhaps there's something they've misunderstood, or perhaps they were unduly harsh. That does happen in my experience. It does happen where assessors who are very experienced in the field don't fully appreciate that they're not trying to peer review an article, they're not peer reviewing a book or anything like that. It's a thesis, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be publishable. In fact, the best assessors, in my experience, are very explicit about saying that. They say in the VIVA, do I think that this is worthy of publication as stands? No, but it doesn't need to be worthy of publication as it stands. So often assessors can forget that, and the VIVA, the oral defense, can remind them of that. They hear the other assessors speak about these matters and they soften. That has happened in my experience. I've seen that happen. So part 2 continued. Did I look at this? So I think I accidentally pressed the button here. Let me go back. So you want a joint recommendation. Ideally, you want all 3 assessors to either say 1 or 2, or a mixture of 1 or 2. In humanities in general, if there are 2 approves of either 1 or 4, or 1 or 2 variety, and one of the assessors says 3, revise and resubmit, generally we have to cede to that assessor, and the student has to make corrections and resubmit to that assessor. But again, speak to your faculty FHDC chair about that. Okay, so I've spoken about what's going to happen in that oral defense, and I've spoken, like I say, from my perspective as someone who's chaired these things, who's had students in these things, and who has sat at the FHDC level. And what I've seen, at least in my department and my faculty, is that there is an effort to be student-centric in the procedures. And at least in at humanities level, there is some leeway in terms of finding an option that is commensurate with policy, but also less stressful to the student than it needs to be. You as the supervisor, whatever happens, you have to do what you need to do to get the corrections, whether they are minor or major, done. You're also part of the assessment process. You also have to submit the necessary documents to your respective faculties. Okay, so that's all I have in terms of the formal presentation that I can offer you. I'm going to open it up to questions now. And like I've mentioned, I am particularly eager to hear what folks from outside of humanities do in your respective faculties. How does it differ from what I've spoken about now? I'm just going to, you can raise your hand or you can use your microphone. You can also use the chat box. If I'm quiet, I'm just waiting for somebody to say something. Thank you all for joining, by the way, for making the time to listen. Do we have any particularly, let's say, young colleagues now who have gone through an oral defense process? I didn't go through an oral defense process. Does anyone have a perspective they'd like to share? This reminds me of teaching online during lockdown, staring at a screen, asking if anyone has any questions and receiving no responses.
Hi, Dr. Singh.
Yes, go ahead.
It's busy. I just had a bit of a question, more like from your experience.
Yes.
So as we'll say a new supervisor, and we are supervising obviously students for the first time, we
Yes.
don't have the experience to rely on, obviously, as our more experienced colleagues in terms of preparing them for their thesis and so on and so forth. What would be your advice in terms of taking them through that process, not only the thesis, but focusing more on the actual VIVA? Because personally, I have not had to defend my thesis either. I kind of just missed the deadline. And UKZ only starting to implement it, I think, within the next year or two. So any advice that you would have from that regard?
Okay, so I think so. Apart from holding a kind of mock VIVA and apart from going through the reports, I think it's useful to give your student a sense of the structure of the oral defense. So I mentioned this four-part structure. Just personally, I would have benefited from that. I didn't go through an oral defense, but I would have benefited from at least knowing the structure, knowing when I would come in and when I would get a chance to respond. Um, I think part of the preparation, a big part of the preparation depends on what's going on in those assessor reports. Often you get the assessor reports that seem to have a positive appraisal of be giving a positive appraisal of the thesis, and if so, the student might be less stressed about that particular assessor. Indeed, I've found this as a supervisor and as an NEC. It generally seems to be the case that students or candidates are stressed about one or two assessors in particular, given what's in the report. So you might want to spend a bit more time on those specific reports. I do know this is not something I've done for my student yet, but I do know a particularly conscientious student who printed her entire thesis and essentially studied her own thesis before the oral defense, took notes, and made sure that she was able to not only respond to what was in those narrative reports from the assessors, um,
Yeah.
but also speak to anything surrounding those questions and be able to pull up any information from a thesis that she needed to. And it turned out that she had a wonderful vibe. She's the person I mentioned, and
Oh,
all
yeah.
that preparation didn't go to waste, but it was something she did do, and she did speak to a supervisor about that whole process, and they looked through the comments together.
Okay. Well, I guess we all know, like going through the process of obviously a PhD, you generally we assume that we know the most about our own project, you know. So I assume that it'll be good for us to encourage our students to critically evaluate our own work to a deeper level than we would in a thesis, to kind of preempt any questions or any areas that the super. I know you can't judge what an assessor is going to ask, but just kind of prepare in that regard, just to obviously give yourself the best possible chance of answering as well as possible.
Yeah, so you can prepare to some extent given what's been said in the narrative reports. There's that. But the student does have to, as you alluded to, the student has to be open to openness. There are going to be things that are going to emerge in the oral defense that are not in those narrative reports. There are things that might arise from the discussion. I've seen this happen where there's a question that the assessor poses that was in the assessment report, and the candidate responds, and then the assessor says, well, the way you've said that there has made me think of something else, or the way you responded isn't the
Yeah.
way you responded, the way you said it out in the thesis itself. So that happens. It's an organic process. And I find it, another thing I've found to be useful is to remind the student that the thesis does not have to be publishable, and the assessors are going to be engaging with them in a collegial way.
Yeah.
It's always been collegial, even when, in my experience, even when the questions have been, let's say, difficult to answer. I think just reassuring the student, because having not been through this process in perhaps in the entire educational system, at least at the higher degrees level, I think there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot that causes a lot of fear. So giving
Yeah.
them as much information as possible is necessary, I think.
Thank you, Doctor.
I have a question in the chat. Do students do oral defense for both the proposal and the thesis? So what we've been talking about is the oral defense for the thesis. Some departments do request that students orally defend their proposals as well. Philosophy has asked students to do that traditionally at master's and doctoral level. This year we set aside that system. We're trying to streamline our processes. So I guess it would depend on the individual departments. But for all departments, definitely students do have to orally defend the thesis after it has been submitted for assessments, and the written assessment, written narrative reports have come in along with the verdicts. I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth repeating. In humanities, we try to get the oral defense session scheduled very quickly after all the assessor reports have come in, within 2 weeks ideally, so the student doesn't have to wait a long time. We are trying to get the assessment process done as quickly as permissible, let's say. Deirdre, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this excellent presentation. I just want to clarify, in Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture, where I'm from, MAs and PhDs, the results serve at an assessment committee. Does this new process mean that the assessment committee at faculty level falls away because the oral defense process replaces that?
So I just want to be, thank you for that, and thank you for your kind words. I think there might be slight differences between different faculties. So speaking about humanities, the faculty level, the FHDC level processes don't fall away. The faculty still has to look at those results, but the oral defense is part of the assessment process. So you get the reports, that's part of the assessment process, and the assessment process continues into the oral defense. The assessment, in other words, assessment process, in other words, isn't done with the written narrative reports. The faculty, our faculty's high degrees committee, still is very deeply involved in the administration of that assessment. Have I understood your question correctly?
I think sorry, let me articulate it a bit better. Our FHDC is not involved in the examination results process. We have a separate committee. I think we just call it the assessment committee, which is a smaller group of people that I think the composition also changes according to who's being assessed. And that committee deliberates on the reports received from the assessors, so that if there are discrepancies or problems, that committee resolves the problem there and then.
So this is very different to humanities. I'm so glad you brought this up. So I suspect that there are different processes. I don't know if that will fall away in your faculty. I'd imagine that is in the way the policy is written, it may continue to be the case. I can't speak to whether it falls away or remains. It sounds good to me, but we don't do it in our faculty. We don't do it that way. We discuss it. The supervisor, the NAC, they have a discussion. The FHDC is it's kept in the loop about the processes. There isn't a third party like the one you described in humanities. It would be a good idea, though.
Well,
it would save us some grief.
We actually discussed in FHDC this morning, because the problem for us now is if that process happens as it does currently, and then there's a VIVA as well, there's going to be perhaps discrepancies. But I think it just means we need to relook some of our processes as they stand. So thank you for your presentation.
Welcome. Before you go, may I ask you, in your faculty, you say it's art and you say it's
Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture, yes.
Okay, so have you been having VIVA/oral defenses up to this point, or is it
no?
New?
We have our first student doing that soon. The student submitting now is going to be the first one.
Okay, good. So I think, I'm not sure if this is correct. I think it might have been a science departments in the hard sciences that did oral exams before they came to humanities. So the humanities wasn't first to take this up, but I think it's now it's being pushed to be a university-wide thing. So it's interesting because I'm not aware of how this is being spread out. I'm not part of those discussions, but it is interesting to hear that your faculty has not yet had an oral defense. So you certainly, I suppose, will have benefited from today's discussion. I should say if it will help make you feel a little more prepared for this. Again, it is intended to be an additional part of the assessment process, and further, as I mentioned, it can help get a verdict that is most favorable to the student if the discussion goes well. And again, I've seen that happen. So it does have its benefits. Thank you for sharing that.
No, I think we all agree, especially in the age of AI, that this is a good initiative.
Yes, I hadn't even thought of that. Thank you. Question in the chat: who is invited to the defense? It is the candidate, the supervisor, the non-assessing chair, and the 3 assessors. That's right. I think someone is unmuted. I can't see who it is. Is that a question? Trying to find that. Anybody else from another faculty outside of humanities?
There seems to be a hand up, Dr. Singh.
Okay, just go ahead. I'm not sure if I can see all the hands.
Good afternoon, Dr. Singh. Thank you very much for your informative presentation. I just want to confirm if I got it clearly during your presentation, how the assessors are selected. For example, if the student work, the thesis that is done is written up, how does the university go about ensuring that suitably qualified and suitably experienced assessors are chosen? You mentioned the international component of the assessment as well.
It sounds like you're asking about the processes for proving assessors.
Selecting assessors,
yes.
suitability, and yeah.
So may I ask which faculty you're from?
Sorry?
May I ask which faculty you're from?
Postgraduate School of Engineering Management.
Okay. So I think what I say should apply to your faculty as well. In humanities, what we say in our policy is that at doctoral level, all the assessors must have PhDs in the appropriate field. So they have to be able to assess the study as a study in that specific field, obviously. I think as I mentioned earlier, at least one assessor must be from abroad. We also choose a backup assessor, just in case the assessors that have indicated that they will serve as assessors when the study is ready to be assessed. Just in case that one of them says that they can no longer serve as an assessor. Here at humanities, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. While you are responding, something is triggered. Just comment also on whether assessors have to be strictly academics or they can be nominated from industry, obviously with the suitable qualification and experience.
Good. So excellent question. They can be from outside academia. In our faculty, if they are outside from academia, say like you've said, they might be some. They might have expertise in the world outside of academia, but in an industry that's related to the study. If they are selected by the supervisor as a potential assessor, some kind of motivation must be offered when those names are going to be presented to the body that actually approves these assessors. So in humanities, the body that approves the assessors is the final body is the Faculty High Degrees Committee, Humanities Faculty High Degrees Committee. They receive the names of the assessors. They receive the detailed CVs of those assessors, and the people on that committee have to look at those CVs and judge whether this person actually is suitable for that study. Of course, before that happens, the supervisor has to decide on appropriate assessors, and that has to be discussed with other members of the department, what I've called the Departmental Higher Degrees Committee. This is the way it's set up in humanities. So we have this. We have various, let's say, what I call safeguards to ensure that the assessors chosen are appropriate to the study. But even with all these safeguards, you will get assessors who, for whatever reason, perhaps while they're assessing this, are going through something that makes them crankier than they could be. But it is an important part of the process, getting the right assessors.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. So if you have a question, you can just go ahead. I'm not sure if I can see all the hands that are being raised.
Dr. Singh, with your permission, maybe we can
Yes.
just give it a minute more to give anyone the opportunity to ask a question. And if not, then we can possibly close the session, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So if anyone has any questions, please either type in the chat box, or as Dr. Singh has said, you can just unmute your mic and ask the question. Thank you.
I will share my slides as well once I've corrected some spelling errors.
Okay, I think with that, if there are no more questions, I think we'll be able to end the session. But before we do, we'd once again like to express our appreciation to all of the attendees for participating, and for the facilitator, Dr. Singh, for all of their hard work, time, and effort in putting this presentation together. Thank you for supporting the RCD unit. Just a bit of information, we'd like to remind you all that there will be 2 more workshops which are running tomorrow. The first would be on assessing chair processes and tips, which will be between 10 to 12. And the second will be non-assessing chair processes and tips, which will run from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock. So we will send out reminders for these workshops shortly. So once again, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Dr. Singh, for a very insightful presentation. Yeah, and with that, I think there's a hand up once again. I think you can unmute and ask your question. Mr. Mapamulo. Or is that a hand, a legacy hand?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Allow me, Chair, to make a request. There was a session that I received. It happened after the event. The title of the workshop was on, I think it was on the 20th of September by Dr. Dian van der Merwe. I see his name on the list. I humbly request, please, that he could share his presentation with me. I've sent my email address on the chat box. I
Okay.
was unable to attend because of conflicts in my calendar.
Okay. Okay. I'll also have a look. If obviously the workshop was run through RCD, then we would have a record of that. So, yeah, if you can also send me an email, I'll put my email address.
Yes, please, I will do so.
And yeah, you can contact it. Yeah, that's regard to any of the past workshops or any material that any of the attendees require. You can just send us an email and we'll be happy to send it through to you. No
I'll
problem.
appreciate that.
Okay, so once again, thank you all for attending. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and hopefully we see you tomorrow for the last 2 workshops in the series. Thank you once again. Have a good afternoon. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Of expected due to the situation. It's not like an agency kind of challenge. So I'm not going to enjoy